Hello and welcome to $5 Hockey Mask. If you've been here before, welcome back. Stevie Wonder once said, "Someday at Christmas, there'll be no war." I doubt either of us will ever see that day. Well, he definitely won't, but it's still a nice sentiment. That doesn't change the fact that there has been a lot of war happening this Christmas season. War is over. Yeah, I don't know about that. Now, a lot of wars have seen fighting on Christmas Day, including literally every one that lasted for a year or longer, which is most of them. But some have broken out on or close enough to the 25th for them to be associated with the holiday. In fact, so many armed conflicts have been referred to as Bloody Christmas over the years that the term has a disambiguation page on Wikipedia. In this video, I'll go over 6 instances of people getting up to some less than festive activities during the holiday season, starting fittingly on December 25th, 1831, in what was then the British colony of Jamaica. By the early 1830s, the "maybe black people shouldn't be property anymore" movement had started gaining traction in Britain, and a lot of literate slaves in the empire's plantation colonies were following the news closely. One such individual was a Jamaican Baptist preacher named Samuel Daddy Sharp. I'm not kidding, that's what people called him. Sharp had been following developments in the movement and believed it was far enough along that slaves getting better rights or even outright emancipation wasn't off the table, and could have realistically been achieved with enough of a push. In fact, some sources claim he thought slavery had already been abolished, but the plantation owners in Jamaica didn't want to admit they had to pay their workers now, so they were keeping them as slaves illegally. Insert obligatory Tim Hortons joke. Other sources contradict this though, and it seems more like he did know it was still on the books and wanted to change that. Either way, Sharp was also inspired by liberation theology, seeing slavery as an unchristian practice that he had a moral duty to oppose. Based on these beliefs, he decided to organize a general workers' strike across the island in order to force the change. He told this plan to a trusted group of his parishioners, who then spread it through other church groups across western Jamaica. Unsurprisingly, given his religious motivations, he chose Christmas Day as a symbolic starting point for his strike. By the time the 25th rolled around, Sharp had managed to rally as many as 60,000 people behind the cause, roughly 20% of the island's entire slave population. The demonstration started off as intended, with the strikers refusing to go back to work until their demands were met. But, in case you forgot, this video is about war, not peaceful protests, so that wasn't the case for very long. On December 27th, around 150 strikers armed themselves and raided the Kensington Planter estate in the St. James parish, eventually burning it down. This attack quickly turned the peaceful strike into an all-out slave revolt, with more of Sharp's armed followers trying to take over the plantations to free themselves Haiti style. The rebels were strategic about the whole thing too. They would only target the houses on the properties during their raids, deliberately leaving the crops unaffected so they could use them for themselves once the rebellion succeeded. Arsons, looting, and attacks on plantation owners continued over the following days, spreading out of St. James to over 100 estates in Trelawney, Westmoreland, St. Elizabeth, and Manchester. As you can imagine, getting word out to 60,000 people without anyone else finding out would have been pretty much impossible. British colonial authorities were well aware of Sharp's plans and had already prepared a response when the revolt broke out. A military force under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Willoughby Cotton had been built up, with 2 gunships anchored off the coast ready to intervene. Several local Maroon militias were also mobilized to back up British ground troops. The Jamaican Maroons have a whole other story behind them that I can't get into here, but they were basically communities of escaped slaves and indigenous Arawak people that were given autonomy by the colonial government in exchange for helping them out militarily during wartime. The rebels managed some early victories against British and Maroon forces, using their numbers and access to ammo stockpiles to repel counterattacks and take over most of the St. James parish. But they were severely outgunned and easily overpowered by the Loyalists. By January 5th, the uprising had been successfully put down, with 14 white planters and 207 rebel slaves killed in the violence. A further 300 would be executed for their role in the rebellion in the following months, including Daddy Sharp himself, who was hanged in May of 1832. This crackdown was later extended to white Christian missionaries who the planters blamed for inciting the violence. 6 of these sympathizers were jailed and 1 was publicly tarred and feathered as punishment. Even though Sharp failed to change anything directly, his movement is still credited with speeding up the end of slavery in the British Empire. The rebellion that he, albeit accidentally, started put a lot of eyes on the already fairly controversial issue of enslavement. People who were already sympathetic with the cause were obviously inspired to ramp up their efforts by Sharp's ideals and the uprising's violent suppression. But the primary outrage actually came from outside the movement, especially among government officials, after the abolitionist missionaries were arrested. Because this was still the 1800s. 500 black people dying in a slave revolt, that's not a big deal. But you start gluing feathers to a guy, that's crossing a line. Someone needs to do something about that. Regardless, the rebellion was a crucial step in the empire-wide abolition of slavery in 1838, and Sharp is venerated as a national hero in Jamaica to this day. Almost a century later, and an ocean away, another failed revolt would take place around Christmas time, though this one would be intended as such from the start. After the end of World War I in 1918, several Balkan nations were unified into a single state. This would later be known as Yugoslavia, but was at the time called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. I'm assuming they changed the name once they realized they weren't the only people who lived there, but didn't feel like adding everyone else to the list. One of these peoples not on the list were the Montenegrins of the Kingdom of Montenegro, which was annexed into the Union in December of 1918 through a decision reached in the Podgorica Assembly. A lot of Montenegrins were not happy about this development. Not the fact that they weren't a country anymore, that was actually a pretty popular decision. The part people had a problem with was the way the Union would work. After its annexation, Montenegro would be under the direct control of the Yugoslav king. This centralized system was not what most people had in mind for unification, instead expecting a more federalist structure where Montenegro would have a degree of local autonomy in the kingdom. It also didn't help that Yugoslav King Petar I was a member of the Serbian Karađorđević dynasty, while the King of Montenegro, Nikola I, was part of a separate royal family that was rival to the Karađorđevićes. This family feud led a lot of people in Montenegro to not care for the Karađorđevićes very much, so the idea of being ruled by them in such a centralized government system was not a particularly welcome one. So, a lot of people wanted Nikola to stay in power as Montenegro's autonomous ruler within the Union, to add a degree of separation from the central government in Belgrade. This movement included some of Nikola's more outspoken loyalists, who formed a group known as the Zelenaši, or Green Faction. This was in reference to the Podgorica Assembly, where anti-unification candidates had their documents printed on green paper, while the pro-unification candidates had white paper. Accordingly, the Greens' local rivals, who supported the central government under King Petar, were known as the Bielaji, or White Faction. Now, the Greens weren't entirely a federalist group. There was a lot of infighting over what they should actually be pushing for. Some still wanted Montenegro to stay in the Union, just with more autonomy, while others wanted to secede outright and be their own country again. Still vaguely unified through wanting to restore Nikola's rule in some capacity, the Greens formed a paramilitary wing led by Brigadier Krsto Popović. Popovich then organized an armed rebellion against the Yugoslav government that broke out on January 2nd, 1919. If you're wondering why a war that started in January is connected to a holiday in December, it's because that holiday isn't in December, not in this part of the world at least. Remember, this is Eastern Europe, where Eastern Orthodox Christianity is predominant, and Orthodox Christmas is celebrated on January 7th instead of December 25th. Anyway, Popovich and his commanders had planned out the uprising as a three-pronged coordinated offensive. 2 rebel contingents would secure the major cities of Podgorica and Nikšić as bases for their final advance on Cetinje, the historical Montenegrin capital. Backed up by a 3rd division built up from the south, the rebels would besiege and capture Cetinje and establish a new government. The first main offensive was launched, fittingly, on Podgorica, and the uprising started to fail immediately. Resistance from the Yugoslav army and the White faction's own paramilitary group was heavy, and the local population around the city was widely unsympathetic to the rebels' cause. The Podgorica contingent was quickly defeated and its forces captured. On January 3rd, the Nikšić contingent encircled their assigned city and started a siege, which went similarly to the previous day's battle. The Podgorica force was supposed to assist with the siege after they took their city, but they were all dead or in jail, so that help obviously never came. The Nikšić force managed to maintain the siege for 2 days before the Whites overpowered them. The Greens continued to lose even more battles over the following days, leading up to their ultimate defeat at Cetinje. The city had been encircled by the southern force since the 2nd, and their siege was still holding by the time the Nikšić contingent was broken on the 5th. But even though they had a steady stream of supplies from Italy, things were still not looking up. The string of defeats had destroyed morale, and the capture of several commanders hurt their coordination, which both already weren't great considering their forces couldn't even agree on what they were fighting for. Plus, if you'll recall, the Greens' plan hinged on the Podgorica and Nikšić contingents backing up the besiegers from their captured positions, which they, again, didn't have. Cetinje saw the most intense fighting of the war, with the Greens managing to hold out longer than at any other battle up until they were finally overpowered by government forces on January 7th. It's a Christmas miracle that killed or injured 98 Green and around 30 White fighters. Yay. Many of the rebels who weren't killed or arrested fled into the local mountains or over the border into Italy, and continued their insurgency into the 1920s through guerrilla warfare, though that ultimately failed too. Popovich ended up defecting from the Green faction and fleeing to Belgium, where he pledged allegiance to the Yugoslav crown and begged to be pardoned for his role in the uprising. As a result of these defeats, Nikola I became the permanent former king of Montenegro, never ruling again, either as head of state or local governor. The nation remained a part of Yugoslavia too, and it stayed that way for almost 100 years, ultimately seceding from Serbia in 2006. The Greens must have been real naughty that year, because none of them got what they wanted on Christmas. Staying in the Balkans and skipping forward a few months, we get to one of the most insane historical events I've ever stumbled upon. Seriously, this is some absolute Mad Lads material. Italy's borders also changed after World War I ended, but they were set to expand instead of disappear like Montenegro's. Italy was on the winning side of the war, meaning it was up to get some extra territory during the Paris Peace Conference. But it ended up with a lot less land than the delegation pushed for, which upset a lot of Italians. One of these upset Italians was Gabriele D'Annunzio, a renowned erotic poet/fascist political writer. If you couldn't tell, he's the absolute Mad Lad candidate I alluded to earlier. D'Annunzio had fought in the Italian army during the war, sustaining serious injuries that left him partially blind. Like many other returning servicemen, he felt betrayed that his sacrifices led to such a disappointing outcome for Italy. Unlike many other servicemen, though, D'Annunzio decided he was going to do something about it. One of the territories that D'Annunzio felt should have been given to Italy was Fiume, a port city on the Adriatic with a large Italian population. Italy had claimed the city at the conference, but it ended up being given to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes instead. Despite this decision, Italy continued to claim Fiume as its rightful territory, putting them in a border dispute over who should control it. On September 12, 1919, D'Annunzio got 300 other veterans together in Ronchi and they went rogue, passing through Trieste and crossing the Yugoslav border to settle this dispute themselves. The government caught on to what they were up to, and an Italian general was sent to intercept them in the outskirts of Fiume and convince D'Annunzio to turn around. This didn't work, and they kept going, advancing on the city in stolen trucks to seize it in the name of the Italian crown. They faced no real opposition from the Yugoslav army and reached Fiume on September 20th. Their arrival was celebrated by the local Italian population as a liberation from Yugoslav rule, and their forces swelled considerably. They quickly succeeded in occupying the city and declared it the Italian Regency of Carnaro, installing D'Annunzio as Regency commander. Again, D'Annunzio wasn't acting on official orders here. This was an unsanctioned invasion that he and his supporters decided to do on their own. But the Italian government was still claiming Fiume as theirs, so aside from sending one guy to finger wag at him, they didn't really do anything to stop him from taking it. They did impose a blockade on the city after he took over, but it was full of massive gaps, so he still had a steady flow of money, weapons, and new recruits. Italian officers were even known to head to shore themselves to party, so the whole thing was pretty much all for show. The Yugoslav government was less impressed with his stunt, though. Understandably so. After all, Italy had tacitly allowed hundreds of rebel soldiers to invade their country, and now the rebel soldiers' leader had taken over one of their cities and created his own little country in it. This predictably worsened their dispute with Italy, which was eventually settled through the Treaty of Rapallo in November of 1920. As part of the treaty, Italy agreed to take back its claim over Fiume and recognize it as foreign territory. This forced the Italian government to finally get D'Annunzio to cut out his LARPing and give the Yugoslavs their city back. He refused the ultimatum they gave him, so the Italian military stepped in to do it for him. On Christmas Eve, 2 warships under the command of General Enrico Caviglia pulled up to Fiume. He wasn't there for simple gunboat diplomacy, though, and they started shelling the city before ground forces moved in. The Rogue Legionnaires' numbers had grown to more than 2,000 by that point, but their resistance didn't last very long. The naval bombardment's primary target was the commander's palace, but it wasn't because Caviglia thought it was tacky or anything. It was actually a pretty nice-looking building. He figured a deliberate, concentrated attack on the palace would force D'Annunzio to flee the area, disrupting the rebels' chain of command and disorganizing their forces. This worked, and 8,000 Italian troops were sent in to clear the city once Gabriele got the hell out of there. After dozens of fatalities on both sides, they'd driven out the Rogue Legionnaires by December 30th. Fiume was then allowed to govern itself as a sovereign city-state in accordance with the Rapallo Treaty, but Mussolini ended up annexing it into Italy a couple years later. It was back in Yugoslavia's possession by the end of World War II and is now part of Croatia, known as Rijeka. Other than blowing up his house and killing a bunch of his friends, the Italian government didn't actually do all that much about D'Annunzio's antics in the aftermath. He was allowed to move back to Italy with no legal repercussions, was given multiple honorific titles, and his literary works were officially published by the government in a national edition. Dankula, come on, get on it. 40 years later, another Christmassy conflict broke out, this time on a new continent. As I'm sure you're aware from more recent and less festive events, the Hutu and Tutsi peoples of Rwanda have historically not gotten along very well. In the years leading up to Rwanda's independence, a social revolution was starting alongside the push for self-rule. Despite making up the majority of the population, Hutus were massively underrepresented in the colonial government, since Belgian authorities saw Tutsis as racially superior and therefore more fit for the roles. Hutu empowerment movement started gaining traction by the late 1950s, with the Party of the Hutu Emancipation Movement winning the country's first election. The rise of this ideology also inspired extremists from both groups to instigate ethnic clashes, which forced thousands of Tutsis to flee to neighboring countries. While living in exile, many of these Tutsi refugees formed armed militant groups known collectively as Inyenzi, or cockroaches. Now, when members of a persecuted ethnic minority are referred to as insects, it tends not to be meant as a term of endearment. But that apparently wasn't the case here. The Inyenzi actually came up with the name themselves as a symbol of their stealth and resilience. It, of course, ended up getting co-opted by Hutu nationalists and started being used in the other way later, but it actually started off having positive connotations. Once the Rwandan Republic was established in 1962, the Inyenzi militias started carrying out raids in the country's border regions to destabilize the Hutu-dominated government under President Gregoire Kayibanda. These early attacks were relatively small in scale and were quickly dealt with by joint Rwandan-Belgian counteroffensives. But a major operation was on the way that would be a lot harder to combat. Starting on December 20th, 1963, several Inyenzi militias invaded Rwanda from the Congo, Uganda, and Burundi in a large-scale coordinated offensive. This invasion was supposedly orchestrated by exiled politician François Rukeba, but that's apparently unconfirmed. Whoever was behind the whole thing, the Congolese and Ugandan incursions didn't work out all that well, and were all pushed back near the border. But the Burundian force, not supposedly led by Rukeba's son Jean Kayitare, would make it a lot further. It was made up of around 250 fighters, calling themselves the Royal Rwandan Army in reference to their loyalty to the old Tutsi monarchy. They crossed the Burundian border into Bugesera district, stopping in Nemba to recruit local Tutsis to their cause, which grew their forces to 600. They then pushed north, moving all the way through Bugesera to the outskirts of the capital to launch an assault on the Gako military base. The site was still under construction at the time, which made it harder to defend, so despite only being armed with bows and improvised rifles, the ARR managed to overrun the base, capturing proper weapons and military vehicles. They then retreated back into Bugesera and regrouped at a displaced persons camp in Nyamata, where they further swelled their forces to several thousand. From there, with their new fighters and captured equipment, they started their ultimate advance towards Kigali itself, apparently intending to overthrow President Kayibanda. The insurgents pushed further and further north, getting within 20 kilometers of Kigali before they were finally repelled. The equipment they'd secured from Gako was a step up from what they'd started with, but still far from enough to outgun the government. Their leader, Kayitare, had fled back to Burundi after getting wounded in combat too, so the command structure was falling apart on top of it all. It also couldn't have helped that their mortal enemy was a guy named Greg. If you find yourself beefing with Greg, you might need to reassess some things. Anyway, these factors converged during the final battle of the invasion at the Kanzenze Bridge, leading to the rebels' decisive defeat just south of Kigali. Okay, maybe not the Greg thing, but the other stuff about their equipment and coordination for sure had something to do with it. The ARR couldn't just march straight up to Kigali since the Nyabarongo River was in the way, so they made plans to cross it at Kanzenze. Rwandan intelligence got word of this, and troops moved in to wait for them at the access bridge. They ambushed the insurgents when they got there and blocked the bridge, trapping them south of the river. Overpowered and uncoordinated, they couldn't force their way through the blockade and had to retreat back over the border. Further Inyenzi raids continued through Christmas, but none made it anywhere near as far inland as the ARRs did. The final incursion from Uganda was routed on the 27th, ending the conflict with hundreds of Inyenzi militants and a handful of Rwandan troops being killed in all. This operation inspired further ethnic clashes across the country, with thousands of Tutsi civilians being killed in reprisal violence by both citizens and state actors. This cycle of violence continued over the decades, culminating in the infamous civil war and genocide in the 90s. Ethnic violence in Rwanda has thankfully died down considerably since then. Instead, it's now being exported to the DRC so the Rwandan government can take advantage of the instability and exploit Congolese mineral reserves. The day after the Inyenzi invasion started in Rwanda, another ethnic conflict would break out back in the Mediterranean. The island of Cyprus is situated at an almost midpoint between the Balkans and the Middle East, which should tell you everything you need to know about its historical political conditions. By the 1960s, these conditions took the form of inflamed ethnic tension between the island's Greek majority and large Turkish minority. Cyprus had been proclaimed as a multicultural republic after getting independence from Britain, with constitutional guarantees for power sharing and cultural accommodations for the Greek and Turkish communities. But that framework didn't hold up for very long. In November of 1963, the ethnically Greek president, Archbishop Makarios III, proposed a series of amendments to the constitution, some of which would reduce the power of ethnic Turks in the Cypriot parliament. This move flared the already unsteady tensions in the country. Contingents of both groups were also building up armed militias as a precaution in case of ethnic violence, an escalation that ironically all but guaranteed a breakout of conflict. This self-fulfilling prophecy would fulfill itself in the early morning of December 21st. In the capital, Nicosia, a group of Turkish Cypriots were stopped on the street by Greek Cypriot police officers and refused to cooperate with their demands. A crowd formed and an altercation ensued, during which shots were fired, though sources differ on who they came from. By the end of it, 2 Turks were dead and 8 others of both ethnicities were injured. This incident was the straw that broke the intercommunal camel's back, and the island's ethnic militias were violently clashing within hours. By Christmas Day, the conflict had escalated to the point of all-out civil war. Fighting was mostly concentrated in and around Nicosia, but clashes were taking place island-wide, spreading to Larnaca, Paphos, Famagusta, and particularly Kyrenia and Limassol. The opposing paramilitaries fought to capture territory in the major cities, burning and looting houses, taking civilian hostages, and carrying out mass executions in acts of ethnic cleansing. Some of the Greek militants even built makeshift tanks out of construction vehicles and used them in offensives in Nicosia and Limassol. They were unironically creating killdozers for combat use. On the 26th, Britain started overseeing peace talks and sent thousands of peacekeeping troops in to try and contain the violence, joined by supplementary forces from Greece and Turkey proper. The Greek Cypriot nationalists were making massive advances, taking territory held by the Turkish militias and expelling or killing both militants and civilians en masse. The ceasefire talks were progressing by the 30th, and the British peacekeepers started to set up a so-called Green Line, segregating Nicosia into designated Greek and Turkish sectors. Negotiations were tested by continuing clashes, though, and almost fell through entirely on February 13th. A large-scale Greek militant offensive was launched in Limassol, further driving out the city's ethnic Turkish population. The ceasefire was soon finalized despite these attacks, and the joint peacekeeping force was transferred to a Canadian UN contingent in late March. The conflict had renewed again by April 4th, with Turkish paramilitaries clashing with Cypriot government forces in Kyrenia. Fighting spread back to the capital and other coastal villages and persisted into the summer. The Turkish military intervened in early August in support of the militias, carrying out airstrikes on government positions until a final UN-brokered ceasefire was signed on the 10th. By the end of the fighting, 364 Turks and 174 Greeks, including civilians, had been killed in the violence, with a further 25,000 Turkish, 500 Greek, and 1,200 Armenian civilians displaced internally. Tensions and occasional flare-ups continued over the next decade, culminating in 1974 when Makarios was overthrown by Greek ultranationalists. This prompted an all-out invasion by the Turkish military to ostensibly protect the Turkish Cypriots from persecution. This established a national Green Line, de facto dividing the island into separate Greek and Turkish republics, a status quo that persists to this day. Finally, 2 decades later, and on the other side of Africa, 2 military dictators are about to put their armies to the test. The Agacher Strip is a 160-kilometer stretch of land along the border between Mali and Burkina Faso. When the latter, then known as the Republic of Upper Volta, got independence, the Agacher was included in its new territory. But Mali disputed Upper Volta's claim over the strip. They asserted that French authorities hadn't properly demarcated the border between the two when they were still colonies, so some of the strip could have been theirs instead. The Upper Voltans disagreed, insisting that there was nothing wrong with the border and all their territory was given to them legitimately. So, the entire Agacher Strip, and all the gold, freshwater, and manganese believed to be in the ground underneath it, was theirs and should stay that way. The 2 countries kept up the dispute, leading to the outbreak of the First Agacher Strip War in November of 1974. This round of fighting ended with no resolution on where the border should be. In 1983, the Upper Voltan president was overthrown in a military coup led by an army captain named Thomas Sankara. You might have heard of him. Sankara established a Marxist military dictatorship in the country, which he renamed to Burkina Faso. Even though Malian President Lieutenant Moussa Traoré was staunchly anti-socialist, the two decided to put their differences aside and work together on the Agacher dispute. They recognized that they wouldn't be able to reach a settlement themselves since their respective goals were exact opposites of each other. So they agreed to have the conflict arbitrated by a neutral third party, submitting the case to the ICJ in September of 1983 so the court could decide for them and they could resolve their issues peacefully. By 1985, relations between Mali and Burkina Faso had completely broken down. The ideological opposition between Sankara and Traoré was starting to cause some problems. The Malian leadership was worried the Burkinabés were going to sponsor a communist revolution in their country, which wasn't helped by Sankara publicly encouraging a communist revolution in their country. The ICJ hadn't reached a verdict yet either, so control over the strip was still in dispute, and an incident in the border area had inflamed tensions. Burkinabe officials had gone into the Malian-claimed section of the strip to collect census data. The census agents were being escorted by soldiers, which the Malian government saw as an armed incursion. Social unrest had also become widespread in Mali over the country's economic issues, and this gave Traoré the perfect way to distract his people from the problems he was causing while simultaneously owning the libs next door. Citing the border incidents as provocation, he launched a surprise military offensive into the Agache on Christmas morning 1985. Malian troops crossed the Burkinabe border from the north and west, backed up by around 150 tanks and support from the Air Force. They quickly overran the northern towns, while Malian fighter jets bombed major cities further inland, killing dozens at Waigua, Djibo, and Nasumbo. The strategy was to establish forward positions near the border so they could push further in towards Bobo Dioulasso, the country's second largest city. They would then encircle and capture it, using it as a base to ultimately move up to the capital and overthrow Sankara. Things didn't go exactly according to plan, though. Sankara had anticipated an assault on Bobo Dioulasso, so he diverted his forces away from the Agache to concentrate them in the west. This left the northern front under-defended, but the targets in that area were more symbolic than practical for the Malian military. So the invasion force breezed through in the north, but Burkinabe defenses were holding on the western front where the Malians' actual objectives were. Sankara's troops were massively outgunned by Mali, which had newer equipment and more of it, but being communist revolutionaries, they made effective use of guerrilla tactics to make up for the imbalance, disabling or capturing several tanks and other vehicles. The front wasn't just stabilizing either, it was starting to turn the other way. Slightly. The Burkinabe Air Force carried out retaliatory strikes in the major Malian city of Sikasso, while ground troops took advantage of breaks in the front line to launch a counteroffensive into Mali proper, raiding the border town of Zegua before retreating. Over the course of the war, several regional powers had tried to broker a peace deal, but their attempts kept falling through. Once his advance started stalling, though, Traoré presumably realized this wouldn't be the quick, decisive win he was expecting, and finally agreed to a ceasefire brokered by Côte d'Ivoire on December 30th. In the 5 days of fighting, around 40 Malian and over 100 Burkinabe soldiers and civilians had been killed. The war ended in another stalemate, meaning there still wasn't a resolution on the Agacher issue. Then, in December of 1986, less than a year after the war ended, the ICJ reached their decision on the matter. They determined that the French colonial authorities did in fact suck at land surveying. The Malian government was right about the border being arbitrary, so they split the strip between them, giving the upper section to Mali. Sankara accepted the decision, and the dispute ended just like that. Traoré literally could have avoided the whole thing if he just waited a bit. He would have ended up winning anyway without having all those people die and losing those tanks. Hey, why did the Burkinabe blush? He saw the Agacher strip. He saw the Agacher strip. So, what have we learned today? What lessons can we glean from the knowledge that war has happened on Christmas at least 6 times? Well, if you're going to organize a peaceful protest, make sure it stays that way. You might start a civil war by accident. If you start a civil war on purpose, you can always just flee the country and say sorry after it's over with. If you start a war in another country without permission from your country, you'll probably get in trouble. Unless you make porn and fascist propaganda, then you'll be alright. It is generally not a good idea to form armed ethno-nationalist militias. And patience may be a virtue, but the opportunity to kill communists and acquire manganese waits for no man. I'm not sure how many of those are actually applicable to anyone watching, but if they are, I hope you heed them. Merry Christmas. Alright, that's it. Hit the like if you like it, hit the dislike if you don't, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to see more when there's more to see, but until then, I'm out.